always sounds so authoritative on this end. I'm not sure whether what you hear or see, but it's been a couple of weeks. We're drawing to a close on the Revelation. So, are there any comments, questions?
Richard, what was the timeline and the decision making to add Revelations to the New Testament?
That's hard to say because we don't have, while scholars can put together a sort of thing, it was in the early centuries. The sort of final list was developed in the early 4th century. The canon, the sort of list of official books, but it was in use. As I say, there were some important people who didn't seem to pay much attention to it. But from our point of view, saying, oh, they decided to do this, they decided to do that. Well, we don't have records enough that say, oh, in the year 287, they voted and said, this is okay. It was just the final list was sort of put together in the age of the ecumenical councils, the 4th century.
Your classes and other books have been so helpful in explaining the period, the history, terminology, and those lessons have really helped me. And I mean, I've really enjoyed this with your explanations, but I still don't really have a clue of what Revelations is trying to say to me personally.
Well, and this just gets into a kind of general thing about how we work with the Bible. And because, there's my own rule of biblical interpretation begins with the Bible doesn't say what you think it says, no matter what you think it says. Okay. Which is a variation on it must have meant something to them back then, or they wouldn't have included it in the book now, would they? And so there are levels of what you want to look at, and I think that it is helpful and important to try to get as close to what it might have meant to them, the initial thing. Then there's how it's been interpreted by the church. And you have to understand that we think, oh, well, the interpretation of the church is sort of what we get in popular discussions of the Revelation to John today. And that's not true. Those date to a tradition that was born in the 1840s. And the 1840s sound like long ago to us, but compared to 2,000 years, it's like saying it may be you may feel like it's a long walk to the mailbox, but think about, walking to Nashville. It's a difference. And we've got 2 millennia of tradition. And for example, in the 4th century, when Christianity was legalized, that's celebrated in the Orthodox Church as what's called the triumph of the church, and is in essence viewed as the second coming of Christ, the beginning of the millennium. And we're going to talk about the millennium here today, if we get there. But the other thing, aside from the traditional view, is what it means to you. And this is something that we do, it can have a deep meaning for you without having meaning for, say, Mary Schumacher, who's sitting to my left. And that's something that comes out of your own experience, your own reading, and your own reflection. it's not something you would teach the whole church, but it might be deeply meaningful. And so I think I've mentioned before, there was a young girl, a friend of my daughter's, who was tragically killed at age 9. And I was asked not to preach at her funeral, which was in Atlanta, but at a service at her parish church in Kentucky, just a Sunday service that they were turning over to that. And I used the images from the 7 letters at the beginning of the Revelation to John, having a new name, clad in a white robe. But I was trying to say her name was Irena, which is Greek for peace. That Irena is beyond our call. You know, we can call out her name, and she will not answer. But there is someone who has a name for her and who knows her and holds her in love. That spoke to me at that time. You know, I wouldn't, if we had any of the 7 letters showing up in church on Sunday, which I don't think we do in the cycle, I wouldn't preach that sermon today, but I can still look back and say that's what it meant. And often there are things that are meaningful to us out of the Bible because they speak to us in that moment. And you'll find that, passages, the New Testament is big on prophecy and saying that the Old Testament is all lined up to point to Jesus. But if you take, for example, the passage that's quoted in Luke, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child. If you go back to that passage in Isaiah, first of all, it's not a virgin, it's a young woman. It gets turned into virgin in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, aparthenoi. But it's also, Isaiah is speaking to the current king about a political situation that's going on and troubles with the Assyrians and the Egyptians. And he's saying, look, there's a woman who's pregnant. By the time her baby gets to be 10 or 11 years old, you're not going to have to worry about this problem. But someone centuries later reading that passage, there's an echo of something they believe in the Greek translation. And so they make use of it. It's a lot like, I like to think of it as like finding an apt quote from Shakespeare, alas, poor Yorick, to be or not to be. That is appropriate in the moment. But if you go back to that scene in Hamlet, that's not what Shakespeare was aiming at.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else? Okay. So we're online. It's working. I'm going to see if we can get the screen to share. Oh boy. And everything to work along with that. So slideshow. All right. We're seeing the collect right now. Is that true?
True.
Are we seeing a biblical passage or still seeing the collect?
We're now at biblical passage.
All right. Let us hope that this is a prediction of how things will be for the rest of the time. All right. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. All right. So as I say, we are coming close to the end of the book and the end of all things. And we come today to, and there are going to be a series of judgments. But here we come to the, essentially, the arrest and trial of the devil, the serpent. So, saw an angel coming down from heaven, and let's just move on there. Saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit, the key to the abyss, and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, threw him into the pit, and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be let out for a little while. We have this odd little tag at the end. But you've got an angel coming down from heaven. We've seen angels coming down from heaven to the earth with special commissions before. The abyss, we've had mentioned before as well. The fifth angel and blew his trumpet, and the star fell from heaven. He's the one who has the key to the bottomless pit. And the abyss is a place where, earlier in the Revelation, various evil creatures emerged to plague the people of God and the world. So the abyss seems to be the place where sort of a holding pen for evil spirits. But here it becomes the prison. The dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil and Satan, is not just thrown in, but he's handcuffed. A great chain. He's got shackles on. So you can imagine him in his orange jumpsuit with handcuffs and the shackles on his feet. And he's being thrown down in the pit. And you'll notice that he is seized and bound and thrown. They're making sure that you get it, that he is under control. And the abyss is locked and sealed on top of it. So there aren't going to be any more evil things coming out of it. You can't deceive the nations anymore until the 1,000 years are over. And we haven't seen this 1,000 years before. We'll get it mentioned a few times in terms of that current understanding, the understanding of what they're trying to say, whether it's, what they meant to say or not. This 1,000 years, often referred to as the millennium, and millennium just means 1,000 years, but a vision of a sort of period of perfection is introduced here. And probably not, like many biblical numbers, it's not something that you would count up to 998, 999, 1,000. It's just a very long time. And so you have, when it comes to the serpent, the devil, the dragon, he's been mentioned before in 12, using all of those terms, deceiver of the whole world. First, he was thrown down to the earth. That's that war in heaven. And he's thrown down to the earth, and that's where the evil in the world comes from. Well, now he's thrown down to the pit. So we've got him taken care of for a while. And I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. Here's our 1,000 years again. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power, and they will be priests of God and Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So, who are these seated on the throne, given authority to judge? Of course, it doesn't say, but if you go back to Matthew and Luke, and these are what are called parallel passages, Jesus says, truly I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man is seated on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You can see that that's also repeated in Luke. This thing where you have parallels in Matthew and Luke, there is evidence that there may have been an earlier collection of sayings of Jesus that Mark didn't use in putting his gospel together, but Matthew and Luke used. Long before there was QAnon, this was referred to by scholars as Q, probably because the German word for source is Quelle, begins with a Q. But at any rate, you have this promise in the Gospels that the apostles will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. And so in Matthew and Luke, it looks like they're going to judge the people of God. And here, they're given authority to judge. And who are the ones that they are judging? Well, they're judging the martyrs. They're judging those who have been through the Great Tribulation. And again, back to that earlier scene, very early, who are these? The souls under the altar. We've had this cast of characters repeated, but they're getting a special dispensation. They are having, being resurrected. They came to life, and they're reigning with Christ for 1,000 years. This is the first one. So you have this sense that those who have persevered, and to go back to what the original book meant, the original audience of the revelation to John, the members of this discouraged church that John is saying will be the subject of a great persecution. If they have persevered, they're going to have this special time, 1,000 years of everything being great with Jesus. Now, down in verse 6, blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. We've got 7 blesseds, and remember the Beatitudes in Matthew, and there's a version of them in Luke as well. But in Matthew, there are 7 Beatitudes. Blessed is, or blessed are. And in the Revelation, there are 7 Beatitudes. And we've already had 4 of them. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of the prophecy, chapter 1. Blessed are the dead from now on who die in the Lord, chapter 14. Blessed is the one who stays awake and is clothed, not going about naked and exposed to shame, 16. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb, 19. And now, blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. And you see, it's a series of blessings that build to what's going on in the moment of judgment. Over these, the second death has no power, and we'll talk about the second death. Yes, like right now. In chapter 2, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. And this is something that comes up in the Revelation. You would think of the people who have died the first death. The second death is what comes after the judgment. Where does it come from? Well, if you look back in Jeremiah, says, when they're inflamed, I will set out their drink and make them drunk until they become merry, and then sleep a perpetual sleep and never wake again. And then in a later thing, they shall sleep a perpetual sleep and never wake. In the Targum, and the Targums are rabbinic commentaries. And in the Targum, the rabbinic commentary on Jeremiah, this, they sleep a perpetual sleep and never wake, says they shall die the second death and shall not live in the world to come. Now, if you go back as far as Jeremiah, there was not much of a sense in the Old Testament, and especially in the earlier parts, of what we would call a life after death. When people died, they were either viewed as having died, and any immortality they had was through their children. But then you also began to have the sense of this place they called Sheol, Sheol, where the king and the peasant lie down together, and maybe there's a sort of shadowy afterlife. But it's only as you get into the later Old Testament that you begin to have this idea that the dead will be resurrected, brought back to life, and judged. And it's pretty solid by the time you get to the New Testament, that the concept of a resurrection preceding a judgment. One of the things that you don't have in the biblical story is the idea of an immortal soul, sort of an indestructible soul, which has become a part of the preaching tradition and is borrowed from the pagan world. The biblical picture is of God resurrecting us, renewing us, bringing us back. That second death is something that may get into something of that the Bible doesn't mean say what you think it says. But there will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. Back to this. And on that priesthood, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. And this whole idea of the people of God being priests, first of all, remember that the priesthood was an order tied to a particular form of worship at a particular place, the Jerusalem temple. And by the time you get to the Revelation to John, the Jerusalem temple has been gone for 40 years. But there is still what I would call a nostalgia for it, an embodied mourning for the loss of the temple. And so throughout the later books of the New Testament, you see Jesus being portrayed as the new temple, or the people of God being portrayed as the new temple. Jesus being the great high priest in Hebrews, and here God's people becoming the priesthood. We don't have this image because the temple's been gone for us for 19 and a half, our 100 years. And so we can't identify with the loss of the temple, but it's one of those things that is buried in New Testament documents. So when in the first century they were wanting to say, well, gosh, what will it be like to be in this new millennial life? And the idea is, well, we're getting the best of the old. And the best of the old is a new priesthood. We're all going to be holy. We're all going to assist in a particular kind of worship of God, although we'll see as we get to the New Jerusalem that it's not just the old order. But don't want to spoil that for you. Okay. Now, when 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth. And, you know, we've already had Satan defeated. We've got him in prison. The question of why would we have 1,000 years and then it all happens again? Nobody seems to have a really good answer for this, except just in my own reflections. Bob, to go back to your question, I would say in the lived experience of working in the church, being part of a Christian community in the midst of society, there seems to be perhaps a question that comes up, well, why don't we ever win? Why doesn't, coming out of the Old Testament, why do the unrighteous flourish? And so the idea that, well, perhaps it's a continual struggle and we're looking for a final victory, but only God will provide that final victory. And while we have our good times, we just can't count on it being forever yet. But you've got this two-stage judgment and end of the world. And there is a kind of parallel in Daniel 7 where, just in the way it's laid out, there are two stages in the final judgment. But Gog and Magog, in order, the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. Well, Ezekiel 37 and 38 gives this really long, extended picture of a final battle between the righteous and unrighteous. And it says here, Gog of the land of Gog. That's my fault. I was typing that in. What it says in Ezekiel is Gog of the land of Magog. So the idea there is that Gog came from Magog. But by the time you get to the New Testament period and afterwards, they become two separate characters, always joined together, Gog and Magog. Woe to thee, O land of Gog and Magog. So instead of the land of Magog, it's the land that Gog and Magog come from. The Sibylline oracles, they're an interesting thing. You can find copies of them online. They've been known for a while. In ancient Rome, you had an order of prophetesses called the Sibyls, and they would get into an ecstatic trance and would proclaim all sorts of things about what was going to happen to Rome. And in ancient Rome, the elders of the city would consult the books of the Sibylline prophecies. Well, those were burned early on in the life of the Christian church when it was official, gotten rid of as bad, nasty pagan stuff. But in the 6th and 7th centuries, there was a collection of Gnostic documents, that's sort of alternative Christian group, that were gathered together, and they said, oh, these are the real oracles of the Sibyls. But they're not. They're early Christian documents. But it just shows that how Gog and Magog become two separate beings, and instead of Gog being the sort of archetypical enemy in Ezekiel fighting against the people of God, here they are, two enemies gathering together for battle. They're as numerous as the sand of the seas. And you can see there's a quote there from Joshua about, and essay and others throughout the Old Testament, just about every time you get an enemy coming against Israel, they're as numerous as the sands of the seashore. You've also got the idea just of a great number there. God says to Abraham, your offspring are going to be as numerous as the sands of the seashore, more than the stars in the sky. So beyond count. They marched up over the breadth of the earth. And you can see a line from Habakkuk about the Chaldeans who marched through the breadth of the earth. Another powerful Old Testament image that just gets repeated again and again. And they surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And camp is used repeatedly in the book of Exodus to refer to where God's people are. This happens in the camp. That happens in the camp. So the pilgrim people of God. And the army comes up and surrounds them, but there's no battle. God's in control. They've already been defeated once. Fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And you can see in 2 Kings, King Ahab sends out soldiers to find Elijah. And he says, if I'm a man of God, let fire from heaven come down and consume you and your 50 men. And fire comes down from heaven. So this is something that God has in his arsenal, and it works here. In the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan, in the biblical commentary by a rabbi on Numbers, the Lord, however, is near the Israelites in the hour of afflictions and kills all of the enemies by a burning breath, a flame of fire that goes out from beneath the throne of glory. So fire from heaven, which is also a description of lightning, is part of God's armament, just sort of proverbial. And the devil, having been taken out of the abyss, well, now he's thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are already there, and they'll be tormented day and night forever. So we'll have Gehenna mentioned in a minute in one of the commentaries. But one of the images of what happens to the evil people comes from a valley in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was built on a series of ridges, and there are valleys in between, called the Valley of Gehenna. And Gehenna was Jerusalem's trash heap. And you have to imagine that smoke and fire were always coming up from it, because people would take their trash down there and light it on fire. So wherever you are in Jerusalem, you could orient yourself by the fire coming from this one particular valley, the smoke. So think of the lake of fire and sulfur as a sort of extreme image of this garbage dump for Jerusalem. So we move into chapter 20. I saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. Earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they'd done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So here we have the opening of the books. And this is such a powerful image that it goes not only back throughout the Old Testament, but it is, comes into really popular culture. I mean, Santa Claus has a book, and he's writing down who's naughty and nice. You're either going to get, it's such a powerful image that it sticks with you. I don't know if you were ever told in elementary school, this will go on your permanent record, or threatened with that. I've always wondered what happens to the permanent record when you get out of high school. Does the FBI get it, or CIA? So this image goes back to Daniel chapter 7. I watched, thrones were set in place, and an ancient one took his throne. Clothing was white as snow, hair like pure wool. His throne was fiery flame. The court sat in judgment, and the books were open. Now, in Daniel, the one who sits on the throne is the Ancient of Days. And here it's perhaps more to be seen as Jesus. And we've already, in chapter 4, it's God who's on the throne and the Lamb. But we have a reference to the white throne in 20, in chapter 19, when Jesus comes to defeat the devil, a battle that is so easily won that it's not really mentioned. He comes to do it and it's done. He's riding a white horse, previous chapter. So there's a connection between the white horse, the rider who judges and makes war, and one who is seated on the throne. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. So we're clearing away all the old stuff, and go back to Matthew chapter 19, the renewal of all things. We're going to get a new heaven and a new earth. And on with apostles being part of that judgment. But the idea of this second judgment, this standing, in Romans, why do you pass judgment on your brother and sister? Don't you know we're all going to be judged by God? And from the apocryphal tradition, Second Enoch, the whole creation, visible and invisible, which the Lord has created, shall come to an end. And then each person will go to the Lord's great judgment. So we're clearing the decks, and we're going to see in the next chapter, the coming of the New Jerusalem, the recreation. But we've had the righteous dead, the martyrs, and here everybody else is showing up. And God's going to open the books, and he's going to go through it. And it doesn't matter whether you died and were buried, or died in the sea. You're going to be brought back. Now, the whole thing about death and Hades giving up their dead, there is a whole apocryphal tradition. It's alluded to in the New Testament, saying that Jesus went and preached to the lost souls in the underworld. But you find a tradition called the harrowing of hell, the plowing up of hell, with some fairly exact descriptions of how on Holy Saturday, instead of resting in the tomb, Jesus went down to hell and preached the gospel to Adam and Eve and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses. And he brings them all up to heaven. And that's one way of looking at it. Here we have the sort of general dead raised up, and they're all judged and then thrown into the lake of fire. Now, in later preaching, we have this idea that the soul, that somehow God has made souls out of something that can't be destroyed and they're eternal. But the image of the lake of fire here is probably more one of destruction than eternal torment. Part of this whole getting rid of all that was old and not good. So if you're not in the book of life, or if you're part of the old creation, we'll just sweep you aside, burn you up, because we're getting ready for the new. And this just is a number of references to when the seal is placed upon the age which is to pass away, books shall be opened. Very books open. Books open. We've already kind of covered that. So those are more apocryphal books, and these would not be found in your apocrypha in the Bible. These are sort of more rarefied apocryphal books. Well, even more references to books. I've got a lot of them. But coming to the idea of this is destruction. 1 Corinthians, Paul says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. We're going to get, even death is going into the fire. And then down in a commentary on Isaiah, their punishment shall be in Gehenna, in the trash heap, where the fire burns all day. Behold, it is written before me, I will deliver their body to the second death. So you have this idea of things like the garbage heap. It's burning all the time, but that's because the garbage is burning up, being destroyed. So having gotten rid of all of the old stuff, we have, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and we just saw that mentioned. And the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, like a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a voice, loud voice from the throne saying, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first thing, the old creation is gone away. And in Isaiah, and this in Isaiah 65, that's the latter part of Isaiah, which is addressed to the exiles in Babylon. I'm about to create new heavens and a new earth. Former things shall not be remembered or come to mind. There's good days coming, which gets sort of translated here as a general promise. In First Enoch, first heaven shall depart and pass away, a new heaven. And in First Peter, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The elements will be dissolved with fire, and the earth and everything is done in it will be disclosed. But in accordance with his promise, and referring back to Isaiah, we await a new heavens and a new earth where righteousness is at home. And you have this strange little line here, first heaven, first earth to pass away, and the sea was no more. But you'll remember that the sea is the place the beast came up out of. The sea is used as an image from the first story of creation, but repeatedly in the Old Testament as a symbol of chaos. the nations, or the place where great sea beasts live. Well, here we don't have to worry about it, because the new creation doesn't have this chaotic, watery element. So for those of you who like to go to the beach, you're out of luck. Sorry. And then this is that same passage in Isaiah, but we go on. I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people to delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. And of course, we get this in Ezra and Nehemiah. The people in exile in Babylon will be coming back to Jerusalem, but they're coming back to a Jerusalem that has the memory of destruction, where there was weeping, crying. But we're looking forward to rebuilding Jerusalem, to a new Jerusalem. And the heavenly Jerusalem is something that appears in the New Testament in a very strange passage comparing Abraham's wife Sarah and the servant girl who is the mother of Ishmael. That the other woman, Sarah, corresponds to Jerusalem. She is free. She's not a slave, like Hagar. She is our mother. So the heavenly Jerusalem. We look forward to a city that has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Again, a new Jerusalem, because our citizenship is in heaven. We're not primarily citizens of America or subjects of Britain or, whatever. Our citizenship is somewhere else. So the New Jerusalem coming down, like a bride, the image of the people of God as a bride is repeated again and again and again in the Old Testament. And remember that in the ancient world, the bride adorned for her husband, she's not only dressed in fancy clothes, but she'll jingle a lot, because she is probably wearing her dowry, gold bangles, jewelry. So a lot of trouble going into that. And then the idea of God's dwelling place being with people. God's promise to Abraham in the early promise of a land and a people is, you will be my people and I will be your God, a special relationship. And then the promise that God will be in the midst of the people. In Ezekiel, the people might have felt in their exile away from the Holy Land that they are separated from God, but the promise is, no, I'm there, a more universal vision of God. Wiping away the tears, Isaiah, Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces. And then in 4th Ezra, sorrows have passed away, and in the end, the treasure of immortality is made manifest. And here we've got death will be no more. So here are the promises of the new heaven, the new Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, which is an image used for the church again and again. And then the end of sorrow, the end of death.
The Jewish nation now go by these things. Is this what fortifies them?
It depends on who you talk to, because the nation of Israel is not one thing. I mean, the nation of Israel in its founding was a secular socialist state. And so it would be like saying, like talking about America and saying, do the Americans believe this or take strength in this? And I say, well, it depends. Are you talking to a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Green Party, or whatever? The people who we talked about a few weeks ago, who are a small group, who are wanting to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, are very much having sort of this kind of vision. For a secular Zionist, it would be more like the state of Israel is just an embodiment of a re-embodiment of the people of Israel, and the homeland is a safe place for them to dwell. Not proven as safe as they had thought, but well, you can try. So that's what we've got for today. We will wrap up next week. And anything to say or comment before we leave off?
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Y'all take care.